All right. My name is Gary Starnes, and this is a presentation in which I want to discuss the idea of soul loss and the counter to that, which would be soul retrieval. Now, soul loss and soul retrieval are important parts of healing in indigenous cultures. Whenever I talk about indigenous cultures, I'm talking about what anthropologists call a primary level culture. A primary level culture is one that is very close to the earth. It's very close to the ground. There's not a lot of development. It's like tribes or individuals who live in a jungle, for example, and have never seen technology. So when I talk about primary level culture, I'm talking about the anthropological definition of that. The opposite of that is what we use when we talk about economics, when we talk about a third world country. So we think of ourselves as a first world economic country, and the anthropologists think of us as a tertiary culture or a third level culture. So all that together, all I'm trying to say is that in a culture that is very close to the root of shamanic practice has a background and history in what is known to them as the soul loss. And it's such that if a child has an accident, runs into a tree or something and gets knocked unconscious, they would take that boy or the child to the shaman, and the shaman would immediately begin to look for where the child may have lost a part of its soul. And so part of the healing of this incident for this child is recovering that lost soul part. That's how far back that soul loss and soul retrieval comes from. It's tens of thousands of years old. All right, so here's the basic idea. If you think about, we can imagine, it's not like this, but you can think about it this way, that whenever you're born, you come into the world as a complete and whole ball of energy. I was looking around earlier for my crystal ball, making a really great presentation, but I couldn't find it. But if you think about coming into the world as a whole, complete ball of energy, like a crystal. And then, life goes on, and eventually you run into something that is traumatizing. It's like, bam, and that crystal part of you gets shattered. It's called a fragmented self. And if that trauma or if that incident is traumatic enough, a part of that crystal, a part of that energy gets ejected and lost. It gets stuck in time and space. And so as you, as the individual, move forward in time, that part of you is left behind. It is literally stuck in time and in space. It is left where that incident happened in your history. That is basically what soul loss is about, okay? Now, as humans, as we grow up, we don't just have one incident. We often have more than one incident, more than one thing that happens to us that may, if it's difficult enough, encourage or lose other soul parts. So you can imagine in our culture, since we don't routinely go back and recover these lost soul parts, by the time you get to be my age, in my early 60s, I've had a lot of opportunities for soul loss. And so it is very possible that we do lose more than just one part of our soul. Now, what's important about that is that if you have lost a part of yourself and it's stuck in time and space, it is not accessible to you. You can think about that even as a quantum of energy, just a little piece of energy stuck in space and time in your past, so you no longer have access to that energy. And so again, as you go through your life and you leave behind more of these quanta of energy, then your energy level decreases over time. You don't have as much as you could have if you had recovered that soul part, if that was still with you. Okay? I hope that makes sense. Now, sometimes this soul part gets knocked out, okay, because of the impact of the event. Sometimes, in some circumstances, that soul part can also choose to leave. And that choosing is dependent on the analysis of that soul part, that if it doesn't leave, the whole complex will die. The types of situations that show up with that are assaults, rapes, those sorts of things in which the event is so onerous and so dangerous that a part of the soul has to go. And often that leads to something like dissociation, where the individual leaves and is no longer present. The third way that some people say that soul parts can be lost is when they are stolen. Now, I'm not really a proponent of the idea of stealing soul parts, although I've come across some instances in which it seemed like that was potentially true, particularly if the individual is a child, and then there's a tendency for children to like give up things because they want to take care of the situation. They want to fix the situation. So they have a tendency to give up of themselves. So I don't think of it so much like stealing, but actually giving up, and then the other person or the other entity has a chance to hold on to it and keep it. And I have run across those for sure in doing soul retrieval work, where the soul part was held by another person. And the negotiation for that is really quite interesting. So that's 3 ways in which you can lose a part of your soul. Now, this kind of leads to an observation that I and other practitioners have made over time, that people who have undergone talk therapy say that the talk therapy works, but only to a certain point. It's like talk therapy can only take you so far. And I believe that part of that is that trauma in particular is a soul wound. In other words, the trauma affects more than just the body and the emotions and the mind. It actually affects the soul. And so whenever you need, or you're working with recovering from trauma, then you also have to work at the level of soul. And so one way of doing that is through soul retrieval. Not the only way. There are other ways to work with it, but soul retrieval is a part of the way of healing or mending the wound of soul loss or soul wounding. So let's talk about that just a little bit more, and then I'll go a little bit more into soul retrieval. Now, it's rather axiomatic that whenever you are working with a talk therapist, they are very interested in not re-traumatizing you. Okay, so let's look at that a little bit. Let's think about time moving forward. And now, as time is moving forward, it's kind of like, as you're approaching a traumatic event, it's kind of like a car wreck. And people talk about whenever something is happening, that time begins to slow down. And as time slows down, you can think of it as kind of dipping down like this until you begin to realize that something is going wrong. You're no longer in control. Things start to slow down and get slower and slower. And it sometimes seems that time stops. And sometimes people say, or they report, that at that point, they may go unconscious, or it may be that they just have a sensation of timelessness in that one point. But eventually, time begins to speed back up again. Eventually, things begin to pick back up, and time begins to move on. And then you're awake, and you're checking the your passenger, you're checking your car, you're checking yourself. What's going on? How am I okay? Are they okay? And so you begin to come back into an ordinary time frame reference. Okay. Now, as we look at that curve, right down at the bottom of that curve is where the soul part is stuck. That's the point in time where that soul part is held, and it's also relative to the location. Okay. Now, when we talk about talk therapy, what happens with talk therapy is that as you're going through your memories, it's like, there it is, and you move on, and then you go back later, and there it is, and then you move on. In talk therapy, you don't generally go down to the bottom of that dip to actually address what the issue is. Okay, that's what soul retrieval is about. It's going down into that dip, finding that soul energy, and bringing it back out and returning it to the client. That's essentially what soul retrieval is all about, right? Okay. So, how does that happen? What is soul retrieval then? Now, soul retrieval is that process of going back into the client's personal history to identify the soul part that has been lost, that is needed right now in terms of the client's healing. I mentioned earlier, we may have lost a number of soul parts, but not all of them are relevant to a particular event or a particular issue for the client. So what the shamanic practitioner will do is do a journey. Usually I'll play my drum. And as I'm playing my drum, then I'm sort of feeling my way into her personal history of my client. And sometimes it's like I can walk through their history. Sometimes I just sort of like go there really quickly. And once I arrive at the place where I'm guided, then I often will encounter sort of a younger version of my client. It's like a representation of who the client was when that soul loss happened. It may be a young child, it may be an adolescent, maybe an earlier version of oneself. I worked with one person, for example, who had a head-on collision and had a near-death experience, nearly died. And so that experience changed her life in some very good ways and some very not so good ways. And so at one crisis point in her life, we decided that what we do is look and see if there wasn't some soul essence that we need to find. And so in my journey then, I wound up going back to the site of that accident. And I was able then to find that soul part, which was represented as a younger version of her sitting on the side of the road waiting for someone to come and pick her up. And she'd been waiting there for a decade in human time. I don't know what it was like for her in her time, but that's the situation where we found ourselves working with her, sitting on the side of the road, waiting for someone to come and pick her up. So once I find or identify the past part, that representation of that part, then often there may need to be a negotiation. I introduce myself to that person. I let them know who I am, why I'm there, that I'm there on behalf of my client, who is now a grown-up version of this soul part of this past version of the person. I need to gain their confidence, and so I will tell them whatever they need to know about who they become in the future. And then I give them a choice. I ask them if they would like to return with me to rejoin them, the adult version of themselves or the elder version of themselves. And if they say yes, then a process begins by which I help them to come with me and return them to the present time And traditionally what happens is that soul part is blown into the heart space and to the top of the head. And that's the entry point for this new energy. Okay. Now, if that soul part says, no, I'm not ready, I don't want to come back, then my promise to them is that my client will journey to them and help them to feel more comfortable, and then we'll try again sometime in the future. But it's very important, at least from my perspective, that both ends of that negotiation agree, because in the future, then that soul part is going to be returned to the individual, to my client, and that's when the work actually begins. The soul retrieval part is not the end of the story. The soul retrieval is the beginning of the integration of this new energy. And this new energy maybe is like a 6-year-old or a 9-year-old or a teenager. And each one of those have their own dynamic. Okay? So that's where the work begins. And it's important also to know that whenever a soul part is lost, then there is a gift that the soul part holds. Okay? And whenever that soul part is returned, then that gift is also returned. And I will give you an example from my own history. And one of the first soul retrievals that were done for me, we encountered an earlier version of myself, probably in about the 5th grade or so. And he was going around in one of those carousel kinds of things on the playground. And he had just been there going around and around and around for a long time. Now, there's a long story that goes with how that particular piece got lost, but it had to do with an accident that happened whenever I was very excited. And whenever that accident happened, I didn't lose consciousness. I wasn't hurt, but it was a shock. And I remembered that incident during the soul retrieval. And then I recognized after the part was returned to me what the gift was. And the gift was joy. Between that accident and when that soul part was returned, I knew what happiness was. I knew what great happiness was, but I didn't know what joy felt like. When that soul part was returned, then I had access to that amazing experience of what joy feels like. And I still kind of get choked up whenever I think about it, because so much time had passed. Think of all the joyous experiences that I may have missed just because I didn't know what joy felt like. But after the soul retrieval, I had access to the ability to feel what joy feels like. And that's what I mean by a gift. It could be, for some clients, for example, it is a gift that they forgot about. It's like they forgot how good a singer they were. They forgot how they enjoyed music. They may have forgotten a talent that they had for acting or ability to empathize with children. I mean, the gifts come in such a variety, and they're all unique to the client. So the soul part can be lost, particularly in times of like accidents, or whenever a teacher reminds us, anytime that you have an encounter with power and you lose a part of yourself, or it's possible that you lose a part of yourself. It doesn't always happen, but it's possible. So soul loss removes some energy from you, and it gets stuck in time and in space, and you no longer have access to it. The cure for that, or the way to address that, is called soul retrieval, in which the individual, or a practitioner, goes back into the individual's personal history, finds the soul part, may have some negotiation involved in whether or not the soul part is ready to be returned, or if that soul part is being held by someone, then there may be a negotiation between the practitioner and that individual, and that can get to be quite challenging, because sometimes they don't want to give it back, right? So then returning the soul part to the client, it's blown into the heart space and into the top of the head, From that point on, it's the job of the client to reintegrate that energy. Now, a good way to do that is by allowing that previous part to express itself. And if you think about trauma that happened for a child early on in childhood, maybe 6 or 7 or 9, what do 6, 7, or 9-year-olds like to do? They like to play. They like to have fun. They like to draw. They like to be creative. And so I encourage my clients then to draw, to play, to find ways to bring that soul part forward and let it play out itself in everyday life. Take your younger self to work day, something like that. Go for a walk, go out and play with the dogs. Let the soul part play. Let the younger version play. I work with a 6-year-old, 6-year-old trauma for myself. And after many years, we get along pretty well together. In fact, he's quite the source of a lot of joy that I have. And whenever I go to a movie or I go to storytelling, then I invite that 6-year-old to come up and be there. So the 6-year-old is the one who really enjoys storytelling. I often think about what it would be kind of neat if I, wore my jammies to storytelling, so my 6-year-old can feel right at home, right? So that's one way that you can work with the returned soul part. Let it express itself. Visit it in your journeys or in your meditations. Remember what it felt like to be that young and have an encounter with that part over and over again. Have a conversation. Become best friends. And by doing that, you begin to pull all that energy together and you integrate it into a whole again until you increasingly approach that original ball, that sphere of energy that you were when you first came into this planet. So that's the idea. That's the goal for soul retrieval, is to pull all of that together and to increasingly allow you to become whole, increasingly whole. Now, another thing that's important to remember is that you don't have to recover all of those parts, because sometimes the original, and if you've probably experienced this, if you've experienced soul loss, is that something will happen and then there are vibrations throughout your life. The same sort of thing happens over and over and over again. Now, as Sandra Angerman says in her book about soul retrieval, it's like a string of pearls. So as a shamanic practitioner, what I want to do is to identify the very first time whenever that soul loss happened. And as I return it to the individual, she says it's like a string of pearls. So it pulls out the first one and all the others are affected by that healing. So if you think about that, the very first one, if you heal that one, then it affects all of the other traumas that happened along the way. That's part of what makes soul retrieval so powerful. I think of soul retrieval as the biggest medicine that there is, just for that reason. And it also is important to have someone that you're working with who knows what they're doing. Because in a different kind of healing that's called curse healing, the curse may affect the practitioner, so that the practitioner may be affected by a bad curse healing. However, by a soul retrieval that doesn't work well, it's the client that gets affected. And the reason seems to be quite clear to me, and that is if I'm returning energy from the past, if I'm returning a part of the person's soul and I am injecting it into their energy field, that's a very intrusive act. It really is. So we want to have everything covered. We want to do it clean. We want to do it with respect. And we want to do it in such a way that everyone is taken care of.
I remember that in the former lesson, you said that it was better to do it with someone, really. Would you say that it is impossible to do alone, or just very, very unwise to do alone?
To do it on your own?
Yes, sorry.
Okay. um, that's a really good point. And I'm glad that you brought it up, because there is a form of soul retrieval that I teach my clients. And it's essentially, it's more or less the same thing, but it takes some sophistication in order to be able to go back into your personal history and work with a memory that you have and treat it pretty much the same way. Now, there's a different process that involves a use of your imagination and connection to this earlier version of yourself. And I don't have time to explain it here. Maybe I can do that at a different time. But there's two reasons that you can't really do that sort of work on your own. Number one is that in order to work with that healing process, you have to be able to have some objectivity about the situation. It's like if it's so traumatic that revisiting it sort of in first person, you can get looped back into it again, and then you start to sort of re-traumatize yourself. You just loop and loop and loop and loop and loop. And that can be a real problem. So in cases of severe trauma, you don't want to go there. The second one is if you can't remember, because the process that I teach works specifically with memories. And if there's something that happened that you can't remember, of course, you can't use that particular technique. But it is, in fact, a form of soul retrieval. And I think in those two cases, you really need to have the help or assistance of a practitioner who can either talk you through that process or simply do the soul retrieval in a more traditional way. Okay. So thank you for that question. It's an important one.